On November the 8th, 1931, in Pocahontas, Arkansas, just before sunrise, a patrol officer named Manley Jackson is walking his beat on a street so quiet you could hear a dog scratch itself 2 blocks over. When the car rolls up and somebody inside waves him over, friendly like the way you'd flag down a neighbor at a gas station. Well, Jackson walks over to the window and then comes out a hand with a .45 caliber pistol attached to it. Well, he gets in and they drive him several miles outside of town, and Fred Barker shoots him several times in the back. They leave the body on the side of the road and they drive off. You know what? Nobody ever knew who did it. It took 40 years to figure it out. It wasn't until 1971 for that murder to be connected to Fred Barker. That's over 40 years, and 2 innocent men went to prison for it in the meanwhile. That's how invisible this man operated. He was killing people before most outlaws of his era had even bought their first Thompson submachine gun. Now, you've heard of Babyface Nelson. Everybody has. 5'4", 133 pounds of pure psychotic energy. The man was fired by Al Capone for being too violent, which is like getting kicked out of Waffle House at 2 o'clock in the morning for being too rowdy. Nelson killed 3 FBI agents, more than any other criminal in American history. He reportedly told the Dillinger gang that he'll walk into a bank, open fire, kill anything that moves, grab the money, and get out of there. So, even Dillinger eventually refused to rob banks with this guy. Because what happens if he's standing in there when he comes in there? Yeah. And while we're naming the era's most dangerous men, Pretty Boy Floyd and Machine Gun Kelly were household names too, but nobody talked about Fred Barker the same way. So I get why the public thinks Babyface Nelson was the most dangerous outlaw of the Depression era, but here's what actually happened. Frederick George Barker, born December the 12th, 1901, in Aurora, Missouri. Average height, average build, nothing about him would make you look twice if he was standing behind you at the feed store. And that was his whole trick. Fred Barker was the youngest son of Arizona Donnie Barker. It's the one that everybody calls Ma Barker. He co-founded one of the most prolific criminal enterprises in American history, personally murdered law enforcement officers, civilians, and even his own mother's boyfriend, and still somehow managed to stay so far off the radar that most people today couldn't pick his name out of a lineup. This is the story of how a kid from the Ozarks built a criminal empire that made more money than some Depression-era banks actually held. How he assembled the crew that included the real gunmen behind the St. Valentine's Massacre, and how he killed more people connected to his own circle than any other outlaw in his generation. Then got written out of history by a bureaucrat in a suit who needed a better story than an outlaw who kills other outlaws and his associates. That's what makes old Fred so much dangerous than Babyface Nelson. Because with Babyface Nelson, you know what you got. But with Fred, you think you got a partner or an associate. And then one day you're floating in a lake face down with your head bashed in. Fred Barker came up in poor Missouri, which in 1901 was the kind of town where everybody was poor. Family moved to Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1912, and Fred and his brother Doc fell in with a crew of juvenile delinquents called the Central Park Gang, which sounds like a club your kid would join at the YMCA, but it's actually a pipeline straight to prison. By 1923, all 4 Barker boys, Herman, Lloyd, Doc, and Fred, were either sitting in a jail cell or sitting in a reformatory. All 4 of them. That's a perfect record. If crime were a sport, Ma Barker would have a bumper sticker on the back of a car that said, "Proud mom of 4 incarcerated athletes." Fred got his first real stint in the pokey for burglary in 1927 and landed in the Kansas State Prison. Now, here's the thing you need to remember. While Fred's in prison, he meets a fellow inmate named Alvin Karpis, nicknamed Old Creepy. And I mean, when your prison buddy's name was Old Creepy, that probably tells you everything about where your life is headed. Fred brings Karpis home with him after they both get out. You know, kind of like bringing a dog home. So he brings him home. Except this stray dog had a photographic memory for bank layouts and zero hesitation about shooting police officers. Here's how the outfit worked. Fred and Karpis weren't smash and grab amateurs. They planned every job. Karpis could walk through a bank once and recall the entire floor plan from memory, like a human blueprint machine. Fred handled the muscle and, the killing when it come to that. The opportunity was simple. Depression-era banks were stuffed with money and guarded by maybe two guys and a lock that your uncle could pick with a butter knife. The inside connection, and this is the part that made them different, was a corrupt St. Paul police chief named Thomas Brown, who they called Big Tom, who basically ran interference for the gang. Big Tom told them which banks to hit, tipped them off about the raids, and eventually guided them from bank robbery into kidnapping, which was where the real money was. The gang also used Hot Springs, Arkansas as a refuge between jobs, a city so corrupt it made St. Paul look like a Sunday school picnic. In 1932, Karpis later recalled that they robbed 11 banks. That's almost one a month. On July the 25th, 1932, they hit the Cloud County Bank in Concordia, Kansas for about $250,000 in cash and bonds. Less than a month later, they took $50,000 from the Second National Bank of Belfast. That's in Wisconsin. The flaw was that every job required more people, and more people meant more mouths to feed when the loot was being split, and more opinions about everything. Well, the agents could never figure or confirm the total take from all their operations. What they could confirm was $300,000 in kidnapping ransom from just two jobs. That's over $7 million at today's money. The Helm kidnapping in June of 1933 brought in $100,000. The Bremer kidnapping in January of 1934 netted $200,000. That's just the kidnappings. Did you know that they kidnapped so many people? Hell, I thought that's something they did in the Middle East. Well, that doesn't include the 11 banks, 11 banks plus, or the payroll robberies, or any of the other scores that the Karpis could rattle off from memory like a grocery list. It's also worth noting that kidnapping became a federal crime under the Lindbergh law. Well, I heard about that one. The Federal Kidnapping Act of 1932 is what they really called it, which meant that the moment the Barker-Karpis gang crossed into that territory, they didn't just have local cops to worry about anymore. They had the full weight of the federal government. Every ransom dollar they collected after 1932 was a dollar with a federal warrant attached to it. Fred had two antagonists closing in from opposite directions. From the underworld, there was the simple reality that the men he recruited were killers. Lawrence Duvall, the gunman in the crew, was personally responsible for multiple police officer deaths. Fred Ghost was also known as George Ziegler, and a man named Byron Bolton had been among the actual trigger men of the St. Valentine's Day Massacre in 1929, allegedly. These weren't guys you managed with a firm handshake and a dental plan. From the bad side, there was J. Edgar Hoover, a man who had built his entire FBI public's image on catching exactly the kind of people Fred Barker was. Hoover needed headlines. Fred was making them. And increasingly, Hoover's top-filled man, Melvin Purvis, the same agent who had become famous for running down Dillinger, was becoming the operational tip of that spear. December the 16th, 1932, the Third Northwestern National Bank in Minneapolis. Fred, Doc, Karpis, and the crew go in. On the way out, Lawrence Duvall kills two police officers, Aaron Leon Evans and Leo Grosky. And Fred Barker, according to his own associates, spots a passing motorist named Oscar Erickson. Erickson was an unemployed man selling Christmas wreaths door to door. Just a guy trying to feed his family 2 weeks before Christmas. Well, Fred becomes mad, fires several shots, hits Erickson in the head, and, that kind of kills him. He is selling Christmas wreaths. That's the moment Fred Barker became fully visible. And he should have cashed out that night. 3 people dead in a single robbery. The take was roughly $22,000 in cash and another $92,000 in bonds. But the heat that came down was worth more than any vault in Minnesota. And that's where the era turns. By 1934, the federal government had finally gotten organized. Imagine that, a government agency that's organized. Hoover's FBI had new tools, new laws, new jurisdiction. The Kansas City Massacre in 1933, where 4 lawmen were gunned down at a train station in broad daylight, well, that had given Hoover exactly the public outrage he needed to arm his agents and expand federal authority. The same political corruption that had protected the Barker-Karpis gang was becoming a liability. Big Tom Brown's protection only went so far when the feds were involved, and Fred, who had been funneling over $10,000 in campaign contributions to a Minneapolis mayoral candidate named Ralph Van Leer, he was just making sure you can keep that guy in business. Well, he found out you can't bribe the whole country. Now, the single most famous thing about the Barker gang is not Fred, it's Ma, Arizona Donnie Barker, the supposedly criminal mastermind who controlled her sons like puppets. You know, it's like when you put your hand in someone's back and go, okay, you got it. That's what J. Edgar Hoover told the American public, at least, and it is, to put it in terms I'm comfortable with, a load of shit so deep you need hip waders. Alvin Karpis said it himself. He laughed at Hoover's claims. Other gang members laughed. Ma Barker was, by most credible accounts, a loyal but largely uninvolved mother who happened to be in the house when the FBI showed up with enough ammunition to invade a small country. Hoover invented the Ma Barker mastermind myth because his agents just killed somebody's mother in a shootout, and he needed the public to think she deserved it. That story's been on the centerpiece of the Barker legend for like 90 years, and it's the single biggest distortion in the entire history of the Depression-era crime. Check out the episode I made with it. I'm pointing, but it ain't there. Back in April of 1932, Fred Barker and Karpis had killed Ma Barker's own boyfriend, a man named A.W. Dunlop. That was her boyfriend. Fred killed his mother's companion like he was taking out the trash. Could have been. That's the kind of person we're talking about now. Some misunderstood bank robbery, living in the babyface Nelson shadow. A man would murder someone at his own mother's kitchen table, kind of, figuratively speaking, and then go plan the next job. January the 8th, 1935. The FBI catches Doc Barker in Chicago. Melvin Purvis led that operation. That's the beginning of the end. 8 days later, January the 16th, 1935, Ocklawaha, Florida. You learn how to say that word, I just say it a few times. A rented cottage out on Lake Weir. The FBI agents surround the house where Fred and Ma Barker are hiding. Somebody calls out for them to surrender. Ma Barker reportedly shouts back, well, go ahead. I guess they were going to surrender or we're going to shoot. And she says, well, go ahead. And then for the next 6 hours, they went ahead. That's the longest shootout in the history of the FBI. She must have said it in some way I didn't. Somewhere between 950 and 1,500 rounds. Anyway, we're back to the neighbors probably heard it in the next county, and they did because the locals started showing up to watch the shootout. Some of them reportedly brought picnic baskets because apparently in 1935 in Florida, a 6-hour gunfight was a spectator event. I can do that one too. It's more like a high school football game with Tommy guns. When the shooting finally stopped, Fred Barker was found riddled with bullets. Ma Barker was dead from a single wound. A Thompson machine gun laying next to her, where they pushed it. Fred was 33 years old. Here's the part nobody sees coming after all of it, after all the robberies and the kidnappings and the murders and 6-hour gunfight. The man who walked away, the man who survived, was Alvin Karpis. Oh, creepy. The friend that Fred had brought home from prison like a stray dog. Karpis was captured in 1936 and became the longest serving inmate in the history of Alcatraz. And he did 26 years on that rock. He eventually got deported to Canada. Trump wasn't president, but they still deported his ass. Then he wrote a autobiography in 1971, and that book is the only reason we know the truth about half of what Fred Barker actually did, including the murder of Manley Jackson that had gone unsolved for 4 decades. Let me run through the rest of them. Herman Barker, the oldest brother, shot himself in 1927 after wounding a police officer rather than go back to prison. Lloyd Barker, the second son, did 25 years in Leavenworth. Doc Barker was killed in 1939 trying to escape from Alcatraz, and Big Tom Brown, the corrupt police chief who had guided the gang into kidnapping, was eventually exposed but never served real prison time because the system protects its own. Dr. Joseph Patrick Morin, the underworld doctor who removed the gang's fingerprints, he simply disappeared, but there's some story about that. Most people believe that Fred had killed him too. They went out like rowing in a boat, him and another guy, and the doctor. They came back, but the doctor didn't. Every single person who touched this operation ended up dead, in prison, or destroyed. Fred Barker, December the 12th, 1901 to January the 16th, 1935, at 33 years old, died in a rented house in Florida swamp with his mama, and the longest gunfight the FBI had ever been in. He earned every bullet. The storybooks got one thing right. The Barker-Karpis gang was one of the most dangerous criminal organizations in American history. What they changed was who was in charge. They handed Ma Barker the credit and gave Fred Barker the footnote because a menacing old woman made a better story than a cold-eyed kid from Ozark who killed everyone and anyone that got in his way, including his own criminal friends. The biggest distortion is at the beginning, it's the ending. Fred Barker wasn't some minor player who died alongside his famous mama. He was the engine, and the reason you've heard of babyface Nelson but not Fred Barker is because Nelson killed federal agents, and that made the FBI look like victims. Fred Barker killed everyone else. That's just made the FBI look slow because he was doing their job for them. Most dangerous man in a room is never the one screaming, it's the one nobody's watching. Remember that, it's like the dog that don't bark is the one that's biting your ass. If you made it this far, hit the subscribe button, hit the hype button, and leave a comment. And I'll see you in the next episode of The Hidden Lens.